Margaret Ashworth, Duchess of Rensmore, stood in her own drawing-room and watched her husband present another woman to her children, as though he were introducing a new steward. She did not cry out. She did not look away. She did not reach for the arm of the chair, though her hand wanted it, badly. She closed her fingers instead around the small brass key that hung against her collarbone on its faded blue ribbon, the one that had been her mother's, and she held it the way another woman might have held a knife. Henry had gone very still beside her. Charlotte had not. By the end of that summer, the county would speak of Mrs. Vivienne Carew only in the past tense, and of the Duchess of Rensmore as a woman who could not be moved, because she had already decided, long before that afternoon, exactly where she meant to stand. The trouble had started, as trouble in that country so often did, in a green and ordinary June, 10 weeks before, when nothing about the summer had announced itself as the one that would end her marriage as she had known it, and begin another one entirely. Rensmore Hall sat at the bend of the river the way a ledger sat at the centre of a desk, unglamorous, load-bearing, the thing that made everything else possible. Margaret had married Julian Ashworth, Duke of Rensmore, 4 years earlier, in a ceremony her father had called sensible, and her mother, had she lived to see it, would probably have called sensible too, in the particular flat tone Constance Colby had reserved for arrangements she approved of, but did not entirely trust. The match had been made across 2 desks by 2 solicitors before it was made across an altar. Margaret had brought £3,000 and a working knowledge of double-entry bookkeeping her mother had drilled into her since she was 9. Julian had brought a title, 4,000 acres, and a coldness that everyone assured her would thaw. It had thawed in places no one else could see. He noticed, eventually, that the home farm's rents had stopped arriving late. He noticed that the tenant cottages no longer flooded every February. He did not connect these facts to his wife, because he had been raised by a father who taught him that a duchess's competence was like good plumbing, essential, invisible, and not a subject for conversation at dinner. His coldness elsewhere had a shape Margaret had learned to read the way she read weather. He was correct with her. He was correct with the twins, Henry and Charlotte, 8 years old and sharp as new pins, in the particular way of a man following a manual rather than an instinct. He kissed her hand in front of guests, and shook it essentially in private. She had stopped waiting for anything else in the 2nd year. She had not stopped noticing that she was waiting. What she did not know, in that green June, was that the Duke's father, dead 3 years now, had left his son more than a title. He had left him a doctrine, delivered across 100 quiet dinners of Julian's boyhood, a man married for the ledger and kept his heart, if he had one to spare, elsewhere and quiet. The old Duke's own wife had left when Julian was 6, and the boy had absorbed the lesson, the way children absorb the lessons that hurt them worst, not as a rule to be examined, but as the shape of the world itself. Julian did not think of himself as a man following a doctrine. He thought of himself as a man being reasonable. It is a distinction, Margaret's mother used to say, that ruins more marriages than cruelty ever has. Mrs. Vivienne Carew arrived at Rensmore in May, ostensibly to call on the vicar's wife, an old-school friend, and remained by careful and deniable degrees through June. She was a widow of 30, warm where Margaret was quiet, quick to laugh where Margaret was quick to calculate, and she had a gift. Margaret recognised it at once, the way one recognises a fellow tradesman, for making herself indispensable to a lonely man without once appearing to try. She called at the Hall twice, then 3 times, always with some small errand, that required the Duke's particular attention. She was, Margaret thought privately, smooth as poured cream, and just as difficult to hold in the hand. Margaret said nothing of it. She had learned, over 4 years, to file certain observations in a drawer of her mind she did not open except at night, for exactly 11 minutes, before closing it again, and going back to the account books. 11 minutes was what she permitted herself. It had been 9. Once, it was creeping upward, and she did not like what that meant. She might have gone on filing and closing for a good while longer, had Julian not decided, on a warm Tuesday at the end of June, that the children ought to know Mrs. Carrow better. He announced it at breakfast, over the toast, in the voice he used for estate business. Mrs. Carrow would call that afternoon. The twins would be brought down to the drawing-room to meet her properly. It would be, he said, a pleasant thing for them to have a friend of the family who took such an interest. Margaret set down her cup. She did not spill it. That, too, she counted as a small victory, later when she had time to count such things. A friend of the family, she repeated. Yes, Julian said, not looking up from his letters. She is very good with children. It would do them good to know her. Margaret looked at her husband, who was not looking at her, and understood, with the particular clarity of a woman doing arithmetic she has done many times before, and always arrives at the same unwelcome sum, that he did not see anything unusual in his own request. That was in its way worse than if he had. Of course, she said. I shall have Mrs. Pettibone bring them down at 4. She rose from the table with the same steadiness she brought to every ledger, every difficult tenant, every wet February. She did not yet know that by 4 o'clock that afternoon her children would say, in roughly 90 seconds and without once raising their voices, everything that 4 years of her own silence had not. Mrs. Vivienne Carrow arrived at 4 precisely, in blue muslin the colour of a cloudless sky, and was shown into the drawing-room with the particular ceremony Julian reserved for occasions he considered important, without understanding why. Margaret sat by the window with her work-basket, because a duchess did not hover, and because sitting gave her hands something to do that was not closing around anything. Your Grace, Mrs., Carrow said to her, with a smile that did not reach the part of her face that calculated. How kind of you to permit this. The children are always glad of new acquaintance, Margaret said, and threaded her needle, and did not look up again until it was necessary. Henry and Charlotte were brought down by Mrs. Pettibone, the housekeeper, who deposited them just inside the door with the flat expression of a woman delivering a verdict she disagreed with, but had been overruled on. Charlotte's hair had come loose from its ribbon. Henry had a smear of ink on his thumb that no one had thought to scrub before company. They stood, side by side, and regarded Mrs. Carrow with the frank, assessing stare of children who have not yet learned that adults prefer to be looked at kindly. Children, Julian said, this is Mrs. Carrow. She is a particular friend of mine, and I hope you will be friends with her too. It was, Margaret thought afterward, the word particular that did it. Not friend. Particular friend. She had heard her husband use precisely that phrase once before, 3 weeks earlier, through a half-closed study door, speaking to his solicitor, Mr. Price, in the low, satisfied voice of a man discussing an arrangement he considered settled. She is precisely what the dukedom required, he had said then, of her, of Margaret, not knowing she stood in the passage with a stack of linen in her arms. Suitable, sensible, nothing more need be said of it. Nothing more need be said of it. She had carried the linen the rest of the way to the cupboard, folded it and put it away, and said nothing of that either, because there had been nothing. at the time, to be done about a sentence already spoken. Now the same man stood in his own drawing-room, using the word particular of another woman. In front of the children he had used the word suitable to describe her to, and something in Margaret went very still and very clear, the way a pond goes still before a hard frost. Charlotte spoke first. She was always the one who spoke first. "Are you going to be our new mother?" she asked Mrs. Carrow, in the clear, carrying voice of a child who has genuinely not considered that the question might be unwelcome. "Because our mother is just there, by the window." The room did not gasp, exactly. It did something quieter and worse, a kind of collective indrawn breath that made no sound at all. Mrs. Carrow's smile did not move, which was its own kind of tell. Margaret thought a real smile would have faltered. "What a funny thing to ask, Mrs." Carrow said. To the room in general, in the bright voice adults use to diffuse a child's honesty. "Of course not, my dear." "Then why did Papa say you were particular?" Henry said, "when he told Mamma she was only suitable?" He said it without heat. He said it, in fact, in the mild, factual tone he used for reciting his Latin, because Henry did not yet understand that some facts are weapons when spoken aloud in the wrong room, and Margaret would spend a good while afterward being grateful he did not understand it, and also grateful, in a way she did not examine too closely, that he had said it anyway. Julian went white, then a dull, ugly red. "Henry, that is not. I never said. You said it to Mr. Price," Henry said, through the study door. "I heard you when I was fetching my hoop. You said Mamma was suitable, and nothing more need be said of it." The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and close, like the air before a storm breaks over standing corn. Mrs. Carrow's gaze went, very briefly, to Margaret by the window, and there was something in it, not quite triumph, not quite fear, something that lived in the narrow country between the two, that Margaret filed away with the rest, for later, for the 11 minutes. Margaret set down her needle. She did not weep, she did not raise her voice. She stood, smoothed her skirts with both hands, and crossed the room to her children, and crouched so that she was level with them both. "Your father and I will speak of this privately," she said to Henry and Charlotte, in a voice pitched for them alone, though the room heard every word of it, because the room had gone that quiet. "You have done nothing wrong. You told the truth. That is never wrong, whatever anyone tells you afterward." Then she rose, and turned to Mrs. Carrow and inclined her head with perfect, terrible courtesy. "You will forgive us. The children's supper is early on Tuesdays." And she walked out of her own drawing-room at an unhurried pace, her children's hands in hers, and did not look back to see her husband's face, because she did not, in that moment, need to. She gave herself, that night, her 11 minutes, sitting at her mother's old writing desk, with the brass key warm from her own skin still in her hand. She did not spend them weeping. She spent them making an inventory, the way her mother had taught her to make an inventory of anything that frightened her. What is actually mine? Not what has been given to me and might be taken back. What is mine? Her competence was hers. Her name on every rent book for 4 years was hers. Her mother's methods, her mother's maxims, the key itself and the desk it opened, those were hers, entire, and no man's doctrine could reach them. At the end of the 11 minutes she closed the drawer of her mind the way she always did, and opened, instead, the desk drawer that held the home farm accounts, because there was a drainage dispute at Fenwick Cross that wanted settling before Michaelmas, and she found, that night, that the settling of it steadied her hands considerably. In the morning she sent for Mrs. Pettibone. "I am not asking you to take sides," Margaret said, when the housekeeper had shut the door. "No, Your Grace," Mrs. Pettibone agreed, in the flat voice of a woman who had already taken one. "You're asking me to bring you the household books early, and to see that the children aren't brought down again without your say-so. I can do both without taking any side at all." She paused. "For what it's worth, Your Grace. That woman doesn't take her tea the same way twice. Watches to see what you'll have, and has the same. I've buried 2 husbands and outlived a war. I know a magpie when I see one." "Thank you, Mrs. Pettibone. Don't thank me yet," the housekeeper said. "Thank me when it's finished." The drainage dispute at Fenwick Cross had been quietly ruining the home farm's northern fields for 2 years, and every man who had looked at it, including Julian's own steward, had pronounced it a matter for a proper engineer, and a great deal of money the estate did not currently have loose. Margaret had been reading her mother's old correspondence on land drainage for the better part of a year, not because she expected to need it, but because her mother had taught her that knowledge kept in reserve was never wasted, only postponed. She walked the northern fields herself on a Thursday, in boots rather than slippers, with the estate's bailiff, a broad, weathered man named Silas Rook, who had farmed that ground before he managed it, and had very little patience for gentry, who told him things about soil he had not learned by having his boots in it. "Beg pardon, Your Grace," he said, not unkindly, "but this isn't a matter for the drawing-room." "No," Margaret agreed. "It's a matter for the 3rd field along the eastern hedge, where the old watercourse was filled in without anyone marking where the tile drains ran beneath it. Your father managed this farm before you, Mr. Rook. Did he keep a plan of the drains?" Rook's expression changed by degrees. The way a man's expression changes when he realizes the conversation is not the one he braced for. "He kept a book," he said slowly. "Never thought much of it. It's in the granary loft, if the mice haven't had it." The book, retrieved and beaten free of dust, showed exactly what Margaret had suspected: a network of tile drains laid 40 years before, filled and forgotten when a previous steward diverted the watercourse for a mill race that had itself been abandoned within the decade. The fix was not a new engineer or a great outlay. It was 3 weeks of labour, 12 men, and £11 in materials, to clear and reconnect drains that already existed. She wrote it up herself, in her own hand, with the figures beside each line the way her mother had taught her, not a request, a plan, complete and costed and ready to be executed on a Monday. She gave it to Rook to take to the Duke, because she understood, without needing to be told twice, that a plan arriving through the bailiff would be read as sense, and the same plan arriving through the Duchess would be read, by a man raised on his father's doctrine, as intrusion. It worked. The northern fields drained by August. Rook, who had not expected much from a duchess who kept to her work-basket, began touching his hat to her with something that was no longer mere courtesy. "You'll forgive me saying so, Your Grace," he told her at the end of it, standing in a field that was, for the first time in 2 years, merely damp rather than drowned, "but I didn't think a lady would know a tile drain from a teapot." "My mother believed a woman ought to know both," Margaret said, "on the theory that a house is only a larger sort of field, and wants draining just the same." Rook laughed, a short bark of a sound, and touched his hat again, properly this time. It was, Margaret thought, walking back to the hall alone, the first unguarded laugh anyone had given her in longer than she cared to count. Julian noticed the fields before he noticed his wife had drained them. He rode out in September, saw dry ground where he expected mud, and asked Rook, with the particular baffled pleasure of a landowner who has been handed a solved problem without being told how what account he owed the fix to. "The Duchess's plan, Your Grace," Rook said. "Found my father's old drain book, knew where to look for it, and what to do once she had." Julian said nothing to that for a long moment. He rode home slowly, and that evening, at dinner, he looked at his wife across the table, for what felt to Margaret like the first time in months. Actually looked, the way one looks at a column of figures that has just, unexpectedly, balanced. "Rook tells me the northern fields were your doing," he said. "They were," Margaret said, and did not elaborate, because she had learned that a fact stated plainly required no defence. "I did not know you understood drainage." "You did not ask," she said mildly, and returned to her soup. It was not warmth. It was not even close to warmth. But it was, Margaret noted privately, filing the observation with the others, the first almost of the year, the first almost smile, quickly suppressed, the first almost question he did not finish asking. Nothing in isolation. She reminded herself of that, the way her mother's voice still reminded her of most things, everything in accumulation. Mrs. Carrow had not called again since the afternoon in the drawing-room, but she had not vanished either. Margaret heard of her from the vicar's wife, in the careful, indirect way county gossip travelled. A visit here, a note there, a mention that Mrs. Carrow's late husband's affairs had left her rather more encumbered than was generally known. Margaret filed that too. A widow whose husband's affairs had left her encumbered was a widow who needed money, and a woman who needed money. In Margaret's long experience of household accounts, eventually produced a document to explain why someone else owed her some. She did not yet know what the document would be. She only knew, with the flat certainty of a woman who had balanced a great many books, that one was coming. The document, when it finally showed itself, arrived by a roundabout road, the way such things generally do. It began with Julian, of all people, telling her about his father. It happened in October, on an evening when the fire had burned low, and neither of them had rung for more coal. An evening that would ordinarily have ended in silence. Instead, Julian, who had been staring into the grate for some time, with an expression Margaret had learned to read as a man doing arithmetic he disliked, spoke without being asked. "My mother left when I was 6, he said. Margaret set down her needlework. She did not say anything, because she had learned, in the drawing-rooms of her girlhood, that the fastest way to close a man's mouth was to look too eager for what came out of it. "My father never said the word left," Julian went on. "He said gone, as though she had died, or been mislaid, rather than walked out one morning and taken a trunk with her. He raised me on a single lesson after that, repeated so many times I stopped hearing it as a lesson at all. A man marries for the land and the line, and keeps whatever softness he has left for elsewhere, quietly, because softness is what had cost him his wife the first time, and he did not intend to lose a second one to it. And you believed him." "I did not think of it as believing," Julian said. "I thought of it as knowing how the world worked. It did not occur to me, until a child of 8 told me otherwise in my own drawing-room, that I had married a woman I called suitable in the same breath I called another woman particular, and that the difference between those two words was the entire indictment." Margaret said nothing for a moment. The fire ticked and settled. "Your father's doctrine cost you your mother's absence and your children's honesty in the same afternoon," she said finally. That is not a small accounting." "No," Julian said. "It is not." He did not apologise. Not yet. The shape of an apology was still weeks away, and Margaret had long since learned the difference between a man confessing a wound and a man closing one. But it was, she thought, the first full sentence of explanation he had ever offered her, unprompted, at some cost to himself. She counted it. She did not yet forgive it. Those were different countries, and she had learned to keep her passport for each quite separate. It was 3 days later that Mrs. Carrow's counter-move arrived, in the person of Mr. Aldous Price, the family solicitor, who called at the Hall looking for a man normally imperturbable, distinctly unsettled. "Your Grace," he said to Julian in the study, with Margaret present because she had long ago made it a condition of her marriage that estate business be conducted where she could hear it, "I have had a communication from Mrs. Carrow's man of business. She holds, or claims to hold, a promissory note in the sum of £4,000, signed by the Duchess's late father, dated the spring before his death, acknowledging a debt to Mrs. Carrow's late husband." The room went very quiet. "My father," Margaret said, "kept every account he ever signed in triplicate, Miss, Price, a habit he taught me before I was 10 years old. If such a debt existed, there will be a record of it in his own hand, in his own books, which are in my possession at this house, in the desk that was my mother's." "She proposes," Price went on, with the particular delicacy of a man delivering an ultimatum he personally found distasteful, "that the debt, with interest, now stands at considerably more than the original sum, and that she would be willing to discuss forgiving a portion of it, in exchange for, her words, your Grace, a settled and comfortable arrangement, and continued acquaintance with the children. She is proposing to buy her way into my nursery with a debt my father never owed," Margaret said. She did not raise her voice. She found, in fact, that she did not need to. The flatness of the sentence did all the work raising it would have done, and more. Julian's jaw had gone tight in the particular way it did when he was containing something. "She will not set foot in this house again," he said. "She will set foot in it exactly once more," Margaret said, "and it will be at a time and before a company of my choosing, Mr. Price, and I will thank you to help me arrange it. A woman who forges a debt onto a dead man's name should be made to answer for it in front of people who knew him living." She rose, and went to the desk that had been her mother's, and took the small brass key from around her neck for the first time in 4 years, and fitted it to the lock. The desk held, as Margaret had always known it would, more than sentiment. Her mother had kept, alongside the household accounts, a strong box of her father's papers that had come to Margaret after his death, and had sat, mostly unexamined, beneath a false bottom Margaret had discovered by accident at 14, and never mentioned to a soul, because her mother had told her, more than once, that some drawers were for keeping and not for showing. It took her 3 evenings to go through everything properly, with Mr. Price present on the 3rd, at her invitation, because a woman assembling evidence alone was easily disbelieved, and a woman assembling it with her solicitor watching was not. What she found was this: her father's ledgers, kept in the meticulous triplicate he had trained into her, showed no record of any loan from Mr. Carrow, living or dead, in the year the forged note claimed, or in any year. What they showed instead, in her father's own economical hand, was a loan running the other direction entirely. £2,000 advanced by Josiah Colby to a Mr. Edwin Carrow in a season of bad harvests, a debt her father had, in the final year of his life, quietly forgiven in full. In a letter Margaret found folded inside the ledger itself, addressed to Mr. Price's own predecessor, instructing that the forgiveness be recorded and never mentioned to the Carow family again. For a debt forgiven and then thrown back in a man's face as an accusation does more harm than the debt itself ever did. "Your father forgave the Carows £2,000, Price said, reading it over her shoulder, and Mrs. Carow has returned the kindness by inventing a debt of 4,000 running the opposite way. She has returned it, Margaret said, by assuming that a dead man's papers stay quiet forever. She did not know my mother taught me to keep things in triplicate too." There remained the note itself, the physical document Mrs. Carrow's man of business had produced. And here Price's professional interest sharpened considerably. He examined the signature under a glass, held the paper to the window, and after a long moment set it down with the particular satisfaction of a man whose trade has just been vindicated. "The signature is a fair copy," he said, taken, I would guess, from some genuine letter of your father's and traced. "But the ink is wrong. Iron gall ink of the age this note claims would have browned at the edges by now, uniformly. This is browned in blotches, the way ink browns when it is aged deliberately, with heat, in a matter of months rather than years. And the paper carries a mill mark that was not in production, by my own knowledge of such things, until 3 years after your father's supposed signature." "Then it is not merely a false debt," Margaret said. "It is a manufactured one, freshly. It is a forgery, Your Grace, in the plainest legal sense of the word," Price said. "And I would remind you that forgery of a promissory note is a transportable offence." Margaret was quiet for a moment, turning the true letter, her father's forgiveness of an honest debt, the maxim about kindness thrown back as accusation, over in her hands. "I do not want her transported," she said finally. "I want her exposed, before the people she meant to impress with her comfortable arrangement, and I want it done in a way that leaves no doubt in this county, ever again, about what happened here." Price inclined his head. "The harvest assembly is in a fortnight, Your Grace. Half the county attends. If you mean to make a point before a jury of your neighbours, you will not find a larger one gathered anywhere else this year. Then it will be the harvest assembly," Margaret said, and folded her father's letter carefully back into the ledger, and thought, not for the first time, that her mother had been right about nearly everything, including the particular usefulness of a drawer that was for keeping and not for showing, until the day it was at last. For showing after all. Mrs. Carrow's second counterpunch came 4 days later, delivered not through Price but directly to Julian, in the form of a sworn statement from a former Colby housemaid, dismissed years before for theft, now claiming Margaret's father had been a man of unsteady character who gambled his debts away and hid the fact from his own family. It was a shabby thing, easily unpicked. The maid's dismissal was itself on record, her motive for spite obvious to anyone who looked, but it arrived designed to frighten rather than to convince. A warning shot meant to show Margaret that Mrs. Carow, cornered, would not go quietly. Margaret read it once, set it down, and did not give it her 11 minutes. Some things, she found, no longer required the drawer at all. "She is afraid," she told Julian, handing the paper back. A confident woman produces one clean document. A frightened one produces 2 shabby ones. We will use both against her at the assembly, and let the county see the difference. The harvest assembly at Rensmore had been held on the home farm's threshing floor for longer than anyone living could remember. A gathering of tenants, tradesmen, the vicar, the magistrate, and every family of consequence for 10 miles, come together under lantern light to settle the year's accounts of grain and gratitude both. Margaret had walked into that barn 4 years before, as a bride no one quite trusted yet. She walked into it now, in October, in a plain grey gown, with her mother's key once more hidden beneath her collar, as a woman who had drained a field that had defeated 3 stewards before her, and the room she entered knew it. Mrs. Carow arrived late, on the Duke's own invitation, extended before he understood what his wife intended, and Margaret had permitted it, because a trial conducted in the accused's absence convinces no one. Julian called the assembly to order himself, a formality Margaret had insisted on, because the county needed to see the Duke standing beside his wife's evidence, not merely tolerating it. "There has been a claim laid against this estate," Margaret said, when the room had quieted, in the sum of £4,000, said to be owed on a debt from my late father to Mr. Edwin Carow. "I should like to answer it, before all of you, since all of you knew my father, and are owed the truth of him as much as I am." She laid the ledger open on the long table, the entry in her father's own economical hand plain under the lantern light, and beside it the letter of forgiveness, and beside that the forged note itself. "My father lent Mr. Carow £2,000 in a bad season," she said, "and forgave it entire, in writing, 3 years before his death, on the condition it never be spoken of, because he believed a kindness thrown back as an accusation does more harm than the debt itself. Mr. Price will confirm the ink and the paper of the note now presented tell a different story than the date it claims." Price stepped forward and said his piece plainly the way he had practised it, about iron gall ink and mill marks and the particular blotching of paper aged with deliberate heat, and the room's attention, Margaret felt rather than saw, began to turn, the way a tide turns, slowly, and then all at once. It was Silas Rook's own father, old Tobias Rook, 81 years old and nearly blind, who rose from his bench near the back without being asked, and said, in a voice cracked but entirely steady, that he had driven the cart himself, 40 years gone, the season Josiah Colby forgave Edwin Carrow's debt, and had heard the 2 men shake on it in this very barn, and had never told a soul, because he'd been asked not to, but reckoned a dead man's honour was worth more than a promise to keep quiet about it, now that the promise was being used against his daughter. Something went out of Mrs. Vivienne Carrow's face at that, some careful light behind her eyes that had been burning steadily since May, extinguished all at once by an old man's memory she had not accounted for. "I have nothing further to add," she said, in a voice that had lost entirely its cream. "I have one thing to add," Margaret said, and the room, which had been murmuring, went still again to hear it. "I could see you charged with forgery, Mrs. Carow, and by the law's letter I would be within my rights to do it. I do not intend to. I understand you are a widow with a boy to raise, and very little behind you, and I understand better than most in this room what it is to be a woman with no ledger of her own, and every reason to fear the future. I will not have you prosecuted. I will have you gone from this county within the month, with the £2,000 my father's kindness already gave your husband written off entire, and never mentioned again, and with £50 settled on your son's schooling, paid from my own dowry and not the estate's, because a child ought not starve for his mother's forgery. That is the whole of my mercy, and I will thank you not to mistake it for weakness." The barn did not applaud. It was not that sort of room. But Margaret felt, all around her, the particular weight of a county recalibrating itself, tenant by tenant, family by family, the way water finds its new level after a dam gives way. and she understood, standing there with her father's forgiven debt open on the table before her, that whatever else happened in her marriage from that night forward, she would never again be spoken of, in that barn or any other, as merely suitable. Julian did not speak during any of it. He watched his wife dismantle, plank by plank, a lie built to humiliate his children and unhouse his name, and he watched her spare, from a position of absolute power, the woman who had built it, and something in his own face, Margaret noted, went through several successive and entirely unguarded changes before settling, at last, into an expression she had not seen aimed at her before. It was not quite shame. It was closer to the particular stillness of a man realizing, all at once, the size of the thing he had nearly lost. The full accounting came 2 nights later, in the study, with the door shut and no solicitor present, because some conversations, Margaret had learned, were owed privacy even when everything preceding them had been owed the opposite. "I want to explain," Julian said. "And I understand that an explanation is not the same thing as an apology, and that you will require both, because you have never once. In 4 years, let me get away with confusing the two." Margaret sat and folded her hands and waited. "My father taught me that love was the thing that had cost him his wife," Julian said, "and I built a marriage on the theory that if I asked for competence instead of love, I could never again be left. I called you suitable because suitable felt safe. It did not occur to me, it took our own children saying it aloud, in front of a stranger, before it occurred to me, that I had built you a cage out of the very same fear that built my father his solitude. I let Mrs. Carrow into this house, because she asked nothing of me that felt dangerous. You have always asked everything of me that felt dangerous, because you asked to be seen. And I did not know how to be seen without believing I would eventually be left for it. That is the explanation," Margaret said. "I have heard it, and I believe it, because it costs you something to say plainly, and a man does not usually invent a story that makes him look afraid rather than merely careless. I am still waiting for the apology." Julian was quiet a moment. "I am sorry," he said, "for calling you suitable in a doorway where our son could hear it, and for believing, even for an afternoon, that bringing another woman to meet my children was anything other than a wound dressed up as kindness. I am sorry it took a forged note and a barn full of my neighbours to make me see what should have been visible across a breakfast table for 4 years." "All right," Margaret said. "All right," Julian repeated, and something in his shoulders came down 1/2 an inch, the way a man's shoulders come down when a debt has finally, actually, been paid. "I have conditions," Margaret said, "and I will say them once, plainly, because I do not intend to negotiate them twice. The home farm's accounts remain mine, in my hand, under my name. As they have been these 2 years, whatever any future steward believes proper. My mother's methods will be taught to Charlotte as well as Henry, because a duchess who cannot read a ledger is a duchess at the mercy of whoever can. I will not mediate between you and your fear of being left, that labour is yours to do, and I will watch you do it, but I will not do it for you a second time, and you will never again use the word suitable of me, in a doorway or anywhere else, unless you mean it the way a farmer means it of good ground, as the highest word he has." "Agreed," Julian said. "All of it." "Then we are agreed," Margaret said. "We are agreed," he said, and the two of them sat for a moment in the particular silence of people who have just signed something neither could yet feel the full weight of. There was, in the days that followed, one further scene Margaret had not asked for, and had not expected Julian, of his own will, gathered Henry and Charlotte in the nursery and told them, plainly, that he had been wrong to bring Mrs. Carrow to meet them, wrong to speak of their mother in the word he had used, and that he was sorry, properly sorry, in the way a father is sorry to children old enough to remember being lied to. Charlotte accepted it with the swift, uncomplicated grace of an 8-year-old. Henry considered it for a long moment, in the manner of a boy weighing a sum, and said only, "You should tell Mama that too." Out loud. Not just to us. Julian had already told her, but he told her again that evening anyway, out loud, because his son had asked it of him, and Margaret found that this, more than the barn, more than the study, was the moment she began, cautiously, to believe him. Proof. Margaret had told her mother's ghost more than once, in the quiet of that writing desk, was not a thing a man said. It was a thing a man did, on ordinary days, when no one was watching to give him credit for it. The proof came in small units, the way her mother had always promised it would. It came in November, when Julian moved his chair at dinner from the head of the table to the place beside her, without comment, and simply left it there afterward, so that every evening from then on they sat shoulder to shoulder over the soup, rather than shouting pleasantries down a length of mahogany. It came in the account books, which he began, unprompted, to read alongside her on Sunday evenings, not to check her figures, he was careful to say, but because he found he wanted to understand what she understood, and did not want to be handed only the tidy summary of it any longer. It came in a small, specific gesture that Mrs. Pettibone reported to the kitchen with some satisfaction the Duke had taken, of late, to pouring the Duchess's tea before his own, unasked, and getting the amount of milk exactly right on the first attempt, which Mrs. Pettibone considered, after 30 years in service, a more reliable indicator of a man's feelings than any speech he might give. Nothing in isolation, Margaret reminded herself, each time filing it. Everything in accumulation. There was one relapse, in December, and she had expected one, because her mother had taught her that real change survived being tested, and false change did not. Julian, faced with a tenant dispute over a boundary hedge, settled it himself in a single afternoon, the old way, without consulting her, the way his father would have, the way he had done for the 4 years before the harvest assembly, without a second thought. Margaret said nothing at dinner. She waited until the twins were abed, and then she told him, plainly, without heat, "You settled the marsh boundary alone today. I would have liked to see the survey first. Not because I doubt your judgment, because that is precisely the sort of decision I asked to be part of, and you made it the old way, out of habit rather than malice, which is worse in a way, because habit is harder to catch yourself at." Julian was quiet a long moment. "You are right," he said. "I did not think of it as excluding you. I thought of it as being efficient. That is, I expect, exactly the excuse my father would have used." "It is," Margaret said. "I will show you the survey tomorrow," he said, "and if it wants correcting, we will correct it together, and I will try to notice, the next time, before I have already done the thing rather than after." He did notice the next time a dispute over a mill lease in January, and brought her the papers before he had so much as drafted a reply, and stood in the doorway of her study while she read them, not hovering exactly, but present, in the particular way of a man who has decided that being present is itself the labour, and not merely a courtesy extended toward it. It was on a night in February, with snow against the windows and the fire built up high, that Julian said the thing Margaret had, in her private accounting, stopped expecting to hear stated outright. "I would choose you," he said, not as a preamble to anything, simply as a fact he had arrived at and wished recorded. "I have been choosing you, I think, since the northern fields drained, though I did not have the honesty to call it that at the time. I am telling you now because a man ought to say a true thing aloud at least once, rather than only proving it in the accounts. That," Margaret said, "is the first sentence you have ever said to me that sounded nothing at all like your father." "Good," Julian said. "I have been trying." She did not say the bare words back to him, because she had never much cared for them, finding them too easily spent and too rarely meant. Instead she said, "Then we will go on choosing each other, on ordinary days, when no one is watching to give either of us credit for it," which was, between the two of them, the same thing entirely, and understood as such. 2 years later, on a warm evening in July, the Duchess of Rensmore stood at the window of the same drawing-room where a mistress had once been presented to her children as a family friend, and watched Henry and Charlotte, 10 years old now, and considerably taller, chase each other across the lawn with the particular shrieking joy of children who have never once had reason to doubt where they stood in a household. Mrs. Vivienne Carew had settled, the county understood, in a market town 40 miles distant, keeping a small millinery shop with the £50 set aside for her son's schooling put to exactly that use. Her son was, by last report, apprenticed to a bookbinder and doing creditably, and Margaret found, examining her own feelings on the matter, that she wished the boy no ill at all, which she counted, privately, as proof that mercy dispensed once from real power tends to keep, rather than curdle, over time. Old Tobias Rooke had died that winter, at 83, and had been buried, at Margaret's particular request and expense, beside his own long-dead wife, rather than in the pauper's corner his family had modestly proposed. Because a man who kept another man's secret honour for 40 years, she said, was owed a stone that would last as long. Silas Rooke managed the whole estate now, in name as well as fact, and the home farm's tile drains, relaid and extended, had not flooded a single field in 2 winters running. The account books bore 2 hands now, Margaret's and Julian's, side by side down every column, and a third, smaller hand had begun appearing in the margins that spring. Charlotte's, copying figures in careful practice strokes, because her mother had made good, precisely on the condition that a duchess's methods passed to daughters as readily as sons. Margaret had begun, the previous autumn, a school at Fenwick Cross for the tenants' children, boys and girls together, taught their letters and their sums both, funded from the estate's own accounts and posted. On a board nailed to the schoolhouse door for any tenant to read, with the wages every labourer on the estate was guaranteed, in writing, regardless of the harvest, a practice unheard of in that county before her, and copied, within 2 years, by 3 neighbouring estates whose owners had watched Rensmore's tenants grow steadily less inclined to leave it. The small brass key no longer hung hidden beneath her collar. It hung now on a hook beside the door of the estate's document room, in plain sight, available to any tenant, any steward, any child of the house who needed to open that drawer and see for themselves what was owed and what was owned. Because a key that had once been a private shield had become, by slow and deliberate degrees, a public door, and Margaret had decided, somewhere in the 2nd year, that this was precisely what her mother would have wanted done with it. Julian found her at the window that July evening, and stood beside her rather than behind her, watching the children on the lawn. "You are not what I bargained for," he said, and there was, in the particular careful lightness of his voice, an old wound being turned over deliberately, on purpose, the way a man turns a scar toward the light to show it has closed. "I believe I said that once, of a woman I called suitable, in a doorway I am not proud of. "I remember," Margaret said. "You are not what I bargained for," he said again, and this time there was no old cruelty left in it at all, only the plain new meaning he had built to replace it, brick by brick, over 2 years of ordinary days. "You are what I would beg for, if it came to that." "I am glad it never had to." Margaret said nothing to that for a moment, only watched her children in the last of the light, and felt the house around her, at last, entirely without the held breath it had carried the whole first year of her marriage, a house that exhaled now, the way a body exhales when a long carried weight has finally, genuinely, been set down. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself impossible to unsee, not through anger and not through tears, but through the plain accumulating evidence of a life competently and honestly built. She had not needed her husband's love to become undeniable. She had needed only her own ledgers, her own patience, and the willingness to let the truth stand in a room long enough for everyone in it to recalculate. Love, when it finally came as a verdict rendered after the evidence, not a rescue offered before it, and that was the only kind, she had come to believe, that ever actually lasted. She had been called suitable once, and had made of that word an entire county's education in what the word was worth. And that, unlike a title, or a debt, or a mistress's borrowed warmth, was not a thing that could ever be taken from her again.